Cool. Hi, this is Sridhar Mupri. I'm with Yes No. I'm one of the organizers of IGDC, and we are very happy to have Joe. Joseph came here with us, who specializes in live ops and product management, and been wore many hats. Now he has his own company, and he's going to talk more about that, as well as he's going to talk about primarily about how to launch games and what to watch out for. So Joseph, please take it forward. I'll be around in the background, and we'll jump back in when we do Q&A.
Great. Hi, everybody. So as mentioned, the focus of the talk today is going to be an approach for hard launch in terms of analytics and how to do that for hard launch. But I'll talk a little bit in more detail about what I mean by that. And as far as just a little bit more background in terms of who I am, so I've had kind of a career in games spanning both the product side, working at companies like FunPlus, but also on the publishing side, working at companies like Sega and NBC Universal. And some of you may know me also because for a while, I kind of created a podcast segment as part of the Deconstructor of Fun podcast called This Week in Games. And very recently kind of retired from that podcast, but some of you may know me from that. In terms of what I'm doing now, we are working on a free-to-play shooter game at Leela Games. So if any of you are interested in what we're doing, we're going to be based in Bangalore and trying to scale that up. And for anyone interested in mobile game dev and free-to-play game topics, please check out my newsletter at gamemakers.substack.com. Okay, so jumping into the presentation, I think it's important to first start with an understanding of objectives. So if you're trying to build a set of analytics to support your specific milestone, like when you're first hard launching, I think it's important to get on the same page in terms of what does that mean, because situationally it could mean different things for different companies or for different games. But and for example, I have a question mark here that suggests that sometimes some companies or some games may go directly from development to hard launch, in which case some of the objectives may be different, for example. But in a typical scenario, when we talk about soft launch versus hard launch, wanted to kind of clarify that as well. But in this typical kind of scenario, and again, different companies, different games could have different situations. A typical approach in terms of soft launch, as far as objectives, would be to do some level of gameplay validation, to have some type of technical validation in terms of making sure all the SDKs and other things are working. But then I would say that a primary focus from the perspective of a product manager should be around what are the unitary economics, meaning for a single player, what do the economics for that player look like? Because in soft launch, you want to be able to prove that out before you try to scale it in hard launch. And one of the primary tools for doing that is by understanding what the ARPU characteristics of a typical player in your game look like. The other thing that we typically do in soft launch is to try to understand and model what the potential player behavior of your players in the game would look like, and then to try and model that and determine what that would look like at scale. And so that's a typical approach for soft launch, which then takes us to hard launch. So again, if these are your objectives, then the important point that I want you to take away is that the way that you design your analytics framework and the specific things that you would be doing should align to support the objectives for this specific milestone. So as far as hard launch, like some companies may be focusing on escape velocity, in which case, some of the things that we're talking about may or may not apply. But generally speaking, again, from a product manager's perspective, some of the things that you'd be looking at are not necessarily economics on a unitary basis now, but now more on a project basis. So for the game, what are the economics of the game, and what do they look like as we start to scale that game in hard launch? So things like the marketing scale and how far we can push marketing And then as we start to harden our understanding of player behavior in the game as we scale, then how do we try to optimize that behavior? Okay, so just kind of starting with in terms of soft launch, some of the things, some of the approaches that we could take in terms of trying to characterize the unitary economics of a player in your game is really oriented around this question about, how well does a single user monetize in the game? And so typical ways of doing this would be to look at base metrics, right? Just all the simple stuff. I'm sure most of you know this, things like DX retention, D1730 retention, ARPDAU, conversion and cumulative conversion, and so we usually start with base metrics, but then sometimes, and this depends on the game, you would also look at certain specific metrics. Like, so maybe for a 4X game, you would look at alliance join in a certain early period of time. You might look at, for a hyper casual game, you might try and check what the average retention days look like. For certain games, it might be battle pass conversion, etc. But there are some, for your specific game, there might be other metrics besides the base metrics that you look at, because these metrics would help inform the longer term monetization behavior of your game, for example. But coming back to what we talked about, the main metric to watch, and I think the most important would be, what does the ARPU curve look like for your typical player in the game? So let's talk about that. So in terms of the ARPU, the thing that and for people in the audience who aren't aware, the ARPU curve just speaks to, how well does a typical user monetize in the game over time. And so, you're tracking you're tracking the players in your game, and you're seeing how well they monetize. And generally speaking, the typical behavior of the players in your game, you're going to see is that usually there's kind of a quick level of monetization, and then it levels out to some point, right? And so some of the typical things that you're going to want to see is to look at your ARPU at specific DX points, like let's say D7, D30, and then eventually, right? Like you're going to want to see what it looks like over the lifetime. But in terms of the characteristics of the curve itself, there are a couple things that you're going to want to be looking towards as well. So the first part is like, where does the ARPU curve flatten out? Right. And so, as I mentioned before, general behavior, and again, every game may be a little bit different in terms of what this curve specifically looks like. But generally speaking, you're going to see some rise to the curve, and then it starts to flatten. And then the other issue is, when does monetization actually flatten out? Now, when you're doing this in soft launch, you're typically soft launching in a lower cost geography, right? And then you might have a primary geographical target of, let's say, the US or Western countries. So what you would try to do in soft launch is to find a country that would have similar behavior or player characteristics to your target country in hard launch. But ideally, so what you're hoping for is that this curve actually remains the same, but in hard launch, it would just have a higher magnitude, right? And so one of the things that we can do from this is then try to develop a model for how would the monetization for our game look like in hard launch in a different country, right? Or if we were to launch globally. And the reason why you would also look at some of these, the ARPU at specific points in time, is that you would want to like checking what's typically done is an analysis around ratios. Like, for example, what is our D30 to D7 ratio? And that would, for example, give you some rough indication if you're doing user acquisition in terms of what your eventual ROAS characteristics would look like from an early point in time. So let's say if you knew your D30 to D7 ratio, for example, in soft, and you're confident that that ratio would hold in for the target country during hard launch, then as you're acquiring users during hard launch, you could potentially have a rough indication of what, at day 7, as you're acquiring users, what your D30 could potentially look like, for example. All right, so I just also wanted to talk about some of the other things that you would be doing during soft launch, and then we'll talk about then we'll focus on hard launch. But The other thing that is often done during soft launch is really around trying to understand different kinds of players in your game and their behavior. So, for example, from a monetization perspective, there may be, not necessarily, but there may be a distribution around the typical classification around you've got your free players, then the spenders in terms of minnows, dolphins, whales. It may not, the actual behavior in your game may be different, but you're trying to characterize what that actually looks like in your game and what that spending distribution is. So let's assume that that is the case. Then what percentage of free? Is it 95% free, 3% minnow, 1.5% dolphin, 0.5% whale? What does that distribution look like? And then in terms of user journeys and state machine models, what I mean by that is like as players are entering your game and soft launch, you want to kind of see what these players do. What are the actions that they take? What do they do before they spend? What turns them into a free player or a whale and things like that? And just pair bucket analysis in terms of if we were to bucket spend of your players in the game, how does that distribute, right? So players that spend nothing, players that spend up to $10, up to $100, up to $1,000, what is that distribution of spend as in addition to like the actual distribution of the kinds of players that spend in the game, right? So that's the type of analysis that we would do on the monetization side. And then from a player behavior side, you would try to characterize the different kinds of players that you would have in your game. A typical archetype here would be like a light player, a medium player, a heavy player. And then what you're trying to see from a player behavior perspective is now then really around content progression. How, in terms of like, when you have a model for content in your game, let's say it's a match 3 game, how fast are players going through your levels? And then in terms of the behavior differentiation, if like, what kinds of players are playing how often a day? Are they, like maybe light players are playing 3 times a day, heavy players are playing 10 times a day, but trying to understand what that looks like. How fast will players be going through your game content, things of that nature. And from there, the one last thing that you want to do, speaking to the economics on a unitary basis, is then to try to understand what your unitary economics would look like at scale, right? And you're not going to be acquiring users at scale in soft launch, but to try and characterize what this potentially could look like, such that, again, this is just an illustrative example, but for example, there are some games in which, at a lower DAO, you may not actually be break even on a unitary basis, but then your variable costs may reduce through scale, and then trying to have a model in your mind for hard launch of what this would look like, but then building that model in soft launch such that when you launch in hard, you're confirming whether this is accurate or not. Okay, so now getting to hard launch and talking about project economics now, right? And so if we have this kind of model in terms of soft launch and hard launch, and we've kind of characterized a soft launch and the economics on a unitary basis, now we're shifting to look at the game on a project basis level. And two things that kind of the way that I look at games now going into hard launch is first in terms of game health, and we'll kind of go into how you would actually do this and create analytics to support measuring game health, but then also game scale, meaning, one, you want to kind of check to see that the game is working relatively well and then there aren't any specific problems, but then game scale then speaks to, well, how big can this game get? So if we were to push marketing, if we were to kind of really push this game, what is the potential amount of money that we can make from a profitability or revenue perspective? So let's talk about each of these in turn. So from a game health perspective, generally speaking, for me, I like to think about it from 3 specific perspectives. And the first is by looking at high-level KPIs. The second is by looking at various funnel or drop-off points in the game. And the third is looking at operating costs of the game. And so speaking in terms of the first part, I would say that a typical approach to analytics and hard launch that I like is generally having a standard set of KPIs, and let's say you're a bigger publisher, regardless of the game. So, you know, regardless of the specific game that you're working on, usually though oriented around a specific genres of games, like whether it's like casual versus midcore, or ideally specific to a genre, you do have a standard set of KPIs, but then you also have KPI specific to the specific game that you're launching. So just as an example, you might have standard KPIs around, what's your daily revenue, how many daily installs do you get from a paid and organic perspective, what's your DAO, what's your SDAO or spender DAO, what is your DX retention, ARPDAO, things like that. But then let's say we're launching a shooter game, then there may be KPIs specific to that game as well. So if it's like a competitive PvP multiplayer game, you might be looking at number of daily matches, average gameplay session time, or average or max match time, meaning the amount of time it takes to match different players. You might want to then take that and then associate that with what is the impact on retention, for example, match drop rate. You kind of get the picture here, which is to say that depending on the specific game that you're launching, you would also create a set of KPIs to then try to gauge the health of the game. And then the approach I also like to take is, once you have this kind of bigger set of KPIs, then over time to go through a set of pruning these KPIs down to a more core set of KPIs. Now, you may continue to sort of instrument, measure, and track these other KPIs, but I think it's important from a PM perspective to have focus, right? And then to understand what are the actual specific set of KPIs that move the needle or have the biggest impact to your game the most. And so from this bigger set of, like, let's say you have, a number of dashboards, bigger set of KPIs, what you want to do is increasingly prune that down to a smaller set of KPIs that are the most important things and that you focus in on to determine whether your game is healthy or not. Is there a problem with the game or not? These are like the top, let's say, 3 to 8 KPIs that you would be looking at to ensure that your game is actually healthy and working properly. All right. Just another quick note, and this is from a Google Play blog about metrics. But the other thing to note is that when you do look at KPIs, in terms of like the type of analysis you would run, there's probably a different talk we can do on root cause analysis. But another way of looking at KPIs is, like, let's say your DAO was dropping. One of the types of analysis that I think you should do is something that I call KPI decomposition, which is to take a KPI and break it down into component parts. But for anyone interested in this specific type of analysis, I would definitely suggest, I think it's called Intro to Metrics by, if you do a search for that on the Google Play blog, you'll see that. And another actually pretty cool blog post from the Google Play folks, by Adam Carpenter, is that there are also specific to the kind of game, but in this case, there might be specific KPIs that you also look at. For example, it was noted by the Google guys that if you look at the first 10 minutes of gameplay, that it has a big impact on, they call it day two retention, but sort of day one retention. And so, like, for the specific game, there might be certain KPIs that you look at that serve as early indicators of longer term health of the game. And so you're trying to be aware of what some of those KPIs are, and then tracking and measuring against that is something that you should also think about. All right, the next, I mentioned the 3 perspectives that I take when it comes to game health, the second being funnel or drop off. And what I mean by this is that you really want to make sure that from a flow perspective, right? So how users are coming into the game or experiencing the game, that there aren't any kind of pain points or major points of drop off in that flow. And so the 3 things I would look at from a flow perspective, and I got this image from Game Analytics blog. It's called A Deep Dive into Funnel Reporting for Games. But it's basic concept, right? You basically instrument different steps in a process. Like, let's say it's the Fatui or onboarding experience of the user. Let's say it's the tutorial, whatever it is, and then trying to determine where there are big points of drop off, and then trying to optimize and eliminate big points of drop off by optimizing that experience. And so, from a funnel or drop off perspective, the things that I would look at is, or to focus on, would be the Fatui onboarding tutorial, that early game experience as users first come into the game, because you really don't want to be losing players as they, during that initial phase of coming into the game. The second would be, your core loop experience. Like, is your core loop tight, and if there's any drop off in terms of that player experience in terms of the core loop, how can you tighten that up? And then finally is the monetization flow. Like, you want to make sure it's very easy for your players to spend. Are there any points of friction as players go into the store, or how various types of dialogues or modals, or call outs to the user to spend in the game, making sure that that is also, from a flow perspective, as smooth as possible. And the third is really around operating costs, which is, when you do go into hard launch, to try and look at the cost for the game. And, especially for games that are, that are barely profitable, or, not so super profitable, I would say, especially in free-to-play, in mobile free-to-play, where we are operating in a auction-based marketplace, especially on the marketing user acquisition side, you want to be able to draw as much margin out of your game as possible. And so in hard launch, the other things you want to look at, not necessarily game KPI specific, but in terms of having specific targets, in terms of, like, what are your server and infrastructure architecture costs? What are your content costs? What does your content pipeline look like? Can you compress costs out of that? In terms of your staffing model, are you operating in terms of your staffing and people as efficiently and effectively as possible? And the other kind of practice that I would also recommend is, like, when you look at the cost of your game, to do a zero-based budget, right? And so to try to determine all the costs that are going into your game, and to see if there are any things that you can actually eliminate from that budget. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about, now that we have done that, the other thing to do from a hard launch perspective is now to think, well, how big can we get this game? How much can we grow it? What is the level of scale that we can achieve? And usually what I like to do is to look at 4 specific areas in terms of optimization, which is now to look at the economy, right? So, is the economy balanced? How deep is the economy? From a monetization perspective, it would be more about, like, the player monetization depth. How much currency can the game sink from players? How fast do wallets turn over? And then in terms of store and sales, is that optimized? And like, whether you want to test conversion in terms of your store to units and things of that nature. But, again, the second area would be monetization. The third area is the content model. Like, you want to confirm and optimize your content model as far as how much content to produce. Are you delivering the optimal amount of content for your audience to maximize the scale of your game? And then finally, marketing scale, meaning that, what does your payback period look like? What are the ROAS characteristics of your game? And then looking at UA spend scale. And so, these are, like, we can go into depth on each of these areas, but just as one specific example, I wanted to talk about marketing scale, just as an example, right? And so when it comes to, like, the UA scale, some of the analytics that you would probably want to look at are things like, as an example, your DX ROAS, meaning your ROAS, or return on ad spend, meaning the amount of money that you spend in ads, how much actually returns back to you in game through monetization on a DX basis. So after, and typically the main, in the industry, usually people look at D7, and for certain types of games, you'd also look at D3 or both. You'd also want to look at DX ROAS versus daily spend as a is a typical measure to try and measure UA spend scale. You'd be looking at your DX ROAS ratios, like as I mentioned kind of earlier, like your D30 to D7 or your ultimate LTV to D7. Marketing spend by game, platform, geo, channel, day, these type of things. And so just as an example, when we're looking at marketing scale, what we're trying to do is to then measure all the primary KPIs that help us understand this. And just as another example in terms of spend scale, so for a specific channel, let's say we were buying on Facebook, for example, and then you were to measure, for example, your daily spend versus D30 ROAS, you can kind of see that oftentimes you'll see kind of like this knee bend, which is to suggest that there's only so much money you can spend on certain channels before you start reaching kind of limitations in terms of scale before your ROAS characteristics start to decline, right? And so here you can see that roughly between $25,000 to $30,000 in daily spend, then your ROAS characteristic starts to decline after kind of a certain point of scale, right? And so you want to understand for the various marketing channels that you have, how much can we push it and still remain profitable? And so then by doing these kinds of analysis, that's how you would determine that scale. And I think I have 4 minutes left. So with that, if there are any questions, sorry, I think I went a little bit long, but if there are any questions, we'll be happy to answer any questions in the 4 minutes left.
Awesome, Kim. That was great. There are like a few questions coming in, I think, right now. This might be a little bit off topic, but I'll still go ahead and ask.
Sure.
Are there any KPIs you measure even before building a game? How to test if your game idea is going to be marketable?
So yes. So for example, I would say and it kind of depends on the game genre, but I would say that a game genre in which that's very popular is hyper casual, right? So with hyper casual games, the primary metric is IPM, installs per milli, meaning like for 1,000 impressions of an ad for a game, how many installs do you get? And I would say that in many cases, especially on the hyper casual side, they would actually market the game before building the game. So I would say that if you're trying to do an art style test, if you're trying to do other forms of testing, that you absolutely can, and in some cases you should be doing some level of testing and measuring KPIs ahead of actual development.
Okay. No, that totally makes sense. And usually, in terms of measurement, is there an easier way to do it for free to play? I know hyper casual, they probably are going to make it just a video to test it out. You do the same thing for a big free to play game too.
Sorry, I'm trying to understand the question. So
I mean, in terms of measuring, possibility of marketability of a game. Do you also, is there any other shortcuts? I mean, I know hyper casual, they probably just make a video and test, how many click-throughs are happening, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of free to play, is there any way to do that by looking at competition, on what works?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the typical metric is IPM. I think if there's a specific use case, then, please let me know. I think it would depend on what you're trying to test at that point, right? If it's art style or concept versus a monetization mechanic or a control scheme, I think there's other ways of trying to test for that besides a Facebook ad. But depending on the objective of what you're trying to learn from the test, I would say the test could, and in some cases should be different. It could also be qualitative as well, in terms of like focus groups and things like that. If you're trying to get feedback or, just some initial thoughts in terms of like a specific mechanic or control scheme or things of that nature.
Cool. So there are some more questions. Okay. Which are the tools you mostly use to create data pipeline for the PM?
Okay. So like from a like data infrastructure perspective, I would say for like analytics, there's a lot of third party. So there's kind of like two approaches. I would say for third-party analytics tools. There's a bunch of guys out there. There's Amplitude, Mixpanel, Leanplum, a bunch of really great vendors there. And then I think from a PM perspective, you'd be thinking about the capabilities that you get with those analytics services in relative to cost. And then I would say that if you're trying to build your own internal data analytics infrastructure, then I would say like right now, a lot of people are for data warehouse. You're using something like BigQuery, Google BigQuery on the data warehouse side, using for visualization. I see a lot of whether it's Periscope or Mode. If you're more SQL based or Tableau. I personally prefer Tableau from a visualization perspective. And then from a client instrumentation telemetry perspective, some people use Firebase, other people use more. I know some open source solutions and other things like that. I think you can use some other things like Segment or other tools on the client telemetry instrumentation side as well. But yeah, that would be a typical for like, let's say a medium-sized game studio having your own internal stack. That would be a typical stack.
Cool. There are a few more questions, Kim, if you have time. Can you actually disable your screen share so that way we have?
Sure.
Cool. Okay, great. And by the way, in terms of to manage funnels, what's the best tool you have used personally?
Well, I think that depends. So if you are, I kind of just talked about some of these analytics tools providers, like a lot of them have funnel analysis built in. So if you're using, if you're using Amplitude, use the Amplitude tool there. Or if you're using, if you have your own internal tool, let's say you're using that Google BQ stack, then just use that. So what I would say, whatever you're using.
Okay. This question goes back to your slide about specific KPIs versus how do you map game-specific KPIs to standard KPIs or even to the core KPIs? How do they interlink? Game-specific KPIs, like how many?
Oh yeah, well the game-specific KPIs are just different, right? And so like, so let's say as an example, I see. Okay, I think I understand the question. Okay, so right, so basically, like for example, one of the things I mentioned was essentially like if you're measuring something, let's say you have a competitive multiplayer PvP type of game, and you're trying to and you're measuring match times, right? And so let's say what you're trying to determine is like you're trying to determine if longer match times leads to lower retention, for example, right? So that I assume that's what they mean by that.
It looks like that's the question.
Yeah. So on the back end, what you would do is, you would, I believe you would run a regression to try and determine that for those players that have experienced the longer match times, then to understand what their retention looks like after having experienced that longer match times relative to shorter match times, for example.
Cool. And see, if there is any drop out there, and then you can turn those levels. So it totally makes sense. Cool. There are a couple of more questions. Can you throw some light on how to run an effective retention test for new games? What factors to consider, country, target audience, and so on? How to run effective retention test for new games? This is more, I'm assuming, during Geo or
retention tests, besides just measuring retention?
Yeah, I think that's the question.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not quite understanding that question, but yeah, I would just measure the retention, right?
So would you want to focus on rolling versus exact day retention?
Fixed.
Fixed retention.
Yeah. I mean, fixed just because, and the reason why I say fixed retention is because if you're trying to do competitive benchmarking, then most people use fixed, right? And I think the problem with rolling retention too is that a lot of people can use different different definitions of rolling retention. Like how far out do you, what is that extended window? Are you measuring out to 30 days to, how long are you measuring out on a rolling basis to consider them part of that, part of that day, for example. And so like, because of the inconsistency in which rolling retention can be measured, fixed retention is cleaner, right? It's there won't be any ambiguity in terms of what's meant by fixed retention, unless, I mean, there's some small things that could be different, but it's not as variable as if you were trying to kind of standardize what is meant by rolling retention.
Yeah, and have you, in your experience, have been seeing, because in the olden days, one of the aspect people used to talk about is MAU versus DAO ratio and things like that. Now we're all talking about regulars and elder users. So what is a better or healthier way to measure health of your game in terms of engagement and retention long term?
I mean, I think it depends on your game. So certainly, Kabam popularized the notion of regulars, and I think for their game, it makes a lot of sense. Like, you wouldn't have a notion of regulars for a hyper casual game, right? Like, the average retention days for most hyper casual games is going to be less than 7 to 10 days, right? So I would say that it's more game specific. One of the things that as far as MAU DAO ratio, to your point, one of the I wouldn't say problem. I mean, I think for some games that metric might actually be useful, but that's also highly influenced by your user acquisition and spend, right? And so if you're buying on crappy channels, but at the same time, it's actually performing well for you from a ROAS perspective, then your MAU DAO ratio might look bad, but the overall contribution to the game might actually be good. So I mean, that's why I think that for your specific game in the context of what you're doing, and this is why sometimes it's good to have product and UA people meet regularly. So it's like, so a PM's not surprised. Oh my God, our MAU DAO ratio is crap now. And then it's like, oh wait, but that's because, Bill in marketing is like, he's got this marketing campaign going, right? And so, so again, it depends. And also the other thing in terms of metrics is like, when you see a decline in one, try to understand what some of the other things that are happening in the game that might be impacting that metric. And so, making sure to kind of understand what KPIs could potentially go together if you're seeing a decline or if you're seeing impact to one.
Awesome. I think that's about it at a high level. There was this one question around, do you invest in a data scientist in-house for data analysis? I mean, I think I would my answer for that would be, data scientist is probably not a role. It's just product managers who should be doing this. But what are you thinking?
I think it depends on your game and it depends on your objectives, right? And so I think that, generally speaking, I would say even before you get your data scientist, like getting a data engineer, that's more practical, in my experience, has been better than having a team of a bunch of data scientists. But I would say, like, if you are able to find somebody who understands games really well and who's more practically rather than conceptually oriented, and again, this depends on your situation and the game that you're working on. But if you do have like a complex mid-core or hardcore game with a lot of different types of drops and things you can sell, and you can do a lot of things in terms of like sales bundling, and there's all sorts of like complexities in your game that you could potentially optimize against, then sure. I mean, having a data scientist, again, situationally, could be very helpful.
Cool. Well, that's about it for today. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for taking time to do this session, and
no problem.
we really appreciate this. You can click on go backstage now.